Late 1991. A factory yard in Hungary, somewhere outside the city of Székesfehérvár. Rows and rows of brand new buses sit parked, engines silent, windshields catching the gray autumn light. They're finished, tested, ready to ship. Every single one of them was built to fulfill an order that, a year earlier, would have been considered one of the safest, most reliable contracts in the entire industrial world. Except the buyer who ordered them doesn't exist anymore. Not went bankrupt, not changed management. The country itself, the actual nation that placed this order, has, in the span of a few months, simply ceased to exist. Its currency is worthless, its ministries are gone. The bureaucrats who signed these contracts no longer have a government to represent. Somewhere in a filing cabinet in this very factory, there are shipping documents, payment schedules, delivery contracts, all of them addressed to an entity that, on paper, still exists, and in reality, has already vanished. This is the story of a company that, at its absolute peak, was arguably the largest bus manufacturer on the entire planet. A company whose vehicles carried millions of people every single day across more than 100 countries, from Havana to Vladivostok, from Ulaanbaatar to East Berlin. A company that didn't fail because of greed or corruption or a single bad decision made in a boardroom. It failed because the single customer it depended on more than any other, an entire superpower, collapsed out from under it almost overnight. And there was nothing, absolutely nothing, its engineers, its managers, or its workers could have done to prevent it. To understand how something that big can fall that fast, and why nobody at the company could have stopped it, we have to go back more than a century, to a small workshop in Budapest that had absolutely nothing to do with buses at all. In 1895, a craftsman named Imre Uri opened a modest carriage and coach building workshop in Budapest. At the time, this was an unremarkable trade. Budapest, like every major European capital of the era, was full of small workshops building horse-drawn carriages, delivery wagons, and coach bodies for the wealthy and the working classes alike. Carriage building was a craft passed down through apprenticeships, a trade of wood, iron, and leather, not steel and assembly lines. There was nothing about this particular shop, on this particular street, that suggested it would one day become a household name across half the globe, supplying transportation to nations its founder would never even have heard of. But Uri's workshop had a habit of adapting early to new technology, rather than clinging to the old ways. As the automobile began appearing on European roads in the first years of the 20th century, the business shifted with it. First building custom automobile bodies mounted on chassis imported from other manufacturers, then gradually developing its own original coachwork designs. This was a common evolutionary path for coach builders across Europe at the time. The ones that survived into the automotive age were the ones willing to abandon the horse and learn the engine. By the 1920s and into the 1930s, the company, which by then had adopted the name Ikarus, a deliberately mythological choice, evoking flight, ambition, and, whether the founders intended it or not, a story that ends in a dramatic and very public fall, had become one of the more respected bus and coach body manufacturers in Central Europe. Its buses and coaches served Hungarian cities, some regional export markets nearby, and built a reputation for solid, dependable construction. This was still, importantly, a modest, privately owned, mid-sized manufacturer. Interwar Hungary was not an industrial superpower. It was a relatively small Central European nation still finding its footing after the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Ikarus built solid, well-regarded vehicles, exported a modest number to a handful of neighboring countries, and employed a workforce that, while skilled and proud of its craftsmanship, numbered nowhere near what would come later. If you had told anyone working on that factory floor in 1938 that this company would one day be shipping tens of thousands of vehicles a year to dozens of countries across multiple continents, they would almost certainly have laughed at you. This was a well-respected regional coach builder, nothing more. To understand just how much of a leap this eventually became, it helps to sit for a moment with what a coach builder's craft actually involved in that pre-automotive era. Building a carriage body in 1895 meant steaming and bending wood by hand, stretching and stitching leather upholstery, fitting iron reinforcement by eye and feel rather than by machine tolerance, and finishing everything with hand-applied lacquer that might take days to cure properly between coats. It was slow, deeply skilled, fundamentally artisanal work, closer in spirit to fine furniture making than to what we'd recognize today as industrial manufacturing. The transition to automobile bodywork in the early 20th century didn't happen instantly either. Early automobile chassis were still, in a real sense, treated as a new kind of engine to be paired with an essentially traditional coach body, and workshops like Uri's spent years gradually working out how a body designed for a horse's pulling power needed to change to handle an engine's very different weight distribution, vibration, and speed. By the interwar years, Ikarus had grown into a genuinely respected name across Central Europe's coach-building trade. But it's worth being honest about scale here. This was still an operation that could be measured in the hundreds of vehicles a year, serving a regional market, competing against other well-regarded coach builders in Austria, Czechoslovakia, and elsewhere, who were all navigating the exact same transition from horse-drawn craft to automotive manufacturing. Hungary itself, during these decades, was a country still finding its economic footing after the dramatic territorial losses and political upheaval that followed the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the end of the First World War. There was nothing in this picture, a solid, well-regarded mid-sized regional coach builder in a small, economically uncertain Central European nation, that pointed toward the extraordinary industrial future waiting on the other side of an entirely different kind of upheaval. Then came the war, and Hungary's wartime alliance with Nazi Germany, followed by Soviet occupation as the front moved west, set the stage for everything that came after. The same pattern we've now seen repeat itself across this entire region. Hungary ended up firmly inside the Soviet sphere of influence in the years following 1945, and by 1949, the Hungarian Communist government, following the standard Eastern Bloc script, nationalized private industry across the country, and Ikarus was folded into the newly centralized, state-controlled industrial economy. Nationalization, across this region, followed a fairly predictable script that we've touched on in earlier videos on this channel. Private owners lost control, state officials took over management, and production quotas began arriving from planning ministries rather than from customer orders. For most nationalized companies across the Eastern Bloc, this transition marked the beginning of a long, slow drift toward stagnation. A company that had once responded nimbly to what customers actually wanted now found itself producing whatever a distant planning committee decided it should produce, whether or not that matched real demand. Many perfectly capable pre-war manufacturers across the region followed exactly this pattern, gradually losing whatever competitive edge they'd once had, becoming smaller and less relevant footnotes within a planned economy that had little use for their original specialties. This is where the story takes its first genuinely strange turn, because unlike so many nationalized companies across the Eastern Bloc that were simply absorbed, stripped down, and left to stagnate, Ikarus was about to be handed a role that would transform it entirely, turning a respected regional coach builder into an industrial giant. And crucially, it had almost nothing to do with any strategic decision the company itself made. This transformation was decided somewhere else entirely, by people who had never set foot in the factory. The Soviet Union, in organizing the economies of its new satellite states after the war, didn't want every country in its orbit trying to build everything from scratch, duplicating effort and competing for the same scarce raw materials. Instead, through an organization called the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, usually known in English simply as Comecon, Moscow effectively divided up industrial specialization across the entire bloc, like assigning departments within one enormous, sprawling company. East Germany, with its strong pre-war precision manufacturing base, got heavy machinery, optics, and certain categories of consumer electronics. Czechoslovakia, with its deep tradition in arms and industrial machinery, got heavy equipment and armaments. Poland leaned into shipbuilding and coal-related heavy industry, and Hungary, in large part precisely because of Ikarus's existing coach-building expertise, was assigned buses. Not some buses for Hungary, buses on an industrial scale for the entire Eastern Bloc and its wider network of allied and trading nations. It's worth sitting with how strange this system was compared to how industries normally develop. In a typical market economy, a company becomes the dominant player in bus manufacturing because it outcompetes rivals, better engineering, lower costs, smarter marketing, superior financing for buyers. None of that competitive process happened here. Hungary didn't win the right to build the Eastern Bloc's buses through some open contest against rival manufacturers in Poland or Romania. It was simply assigned the role, the way a manager might assign one employee to handle invoicing and another to handle client calls, based on which department already had some relevant existing skill. Ikarus's success in this sense was never really about winning a competition. It was about being handed a monopoly, guaranteed by treaty and political alignment rather than earned through market performance. That's an enormously comfortable position to be in for as long as the system holds together. And it's an enormously dangerous position to be in the moment it doesn't, because a company that has never had to fight for customers has also never developed the muscles, the sales networks, the flexible pricing, the constant product iteration that let a normal company survive losing one. This single planning decision, made in offices far outside Hungary's control, by people optimizing an entire continental economic system rather than thinking about any one factory in Székesfehérvár, is the reason a modest Budapest coach builder was about to become one of the largest vehicle manufacturers on the face of the earth. And it is also, though absolutely nobody could have known it at the time, the exact same decision that would eventually, decades later, destroy it completely. Because when your entire industrial identity is built around serving one economic bloc, one set of centrally coordinated trading partners, and, as we're about to see, increasingly, one single dominant customer above all others, you inherit an extraordinary, almost invisible vulnerability. A vulnerability that stays completely hidden as long as the system around it keeps functioning, and becomes catastrophic the moment it doesn't. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because first, this arrangement made Ikarus into something genuinely spectacular, a real industrial success story, not a propaganda fiction. Under state direction, Ikarus expanded at a pace that would be almost unthinkable for a private company operating inside a normal competitive market, where growth has to be earned customer by customer, contract by contract. New production facilities were built throughout the 1950s and 1960s, most significantly, a massive plant complex in Székesfehérvár, a city roughly an hour southwest of Budapest that would, over the following decades, become almost synonymous with the Ikarus name. A genuine company town in every meaningful sense, in much the same way Zwickau became synonymous with the Trabant over in East Germany. Generations of families in Székesfehérvár would come to define their entire livelihood, their entire social identity, around this one sprawling industrial complex. And the products coming out of these factories were not, by any honest measure, primitive or crude. This is a detail that often gets lost when people picture Eastern Bloc manufacturing as universally backward, copying Western designs a decade late with inferior materials. Ikarus engineers developed the Ikarus 280, an articulated bus, essentially two separate passenger compartments connected by a flexible, accordion-like hinge section in the middle, allowing a single vehicle to carry dramatically more passengers than a conventional rigid bus, while still remaining maneuverable enough to navigate tight, winding urban streets designed centuries before the automobile existed. This bendy bus design wasn't some clumsy, delayed imitation of Western technology. It was a genuinely sophisticated, competitive piece of engineering for its era, and versions of the articulated bus concept were being explored simultaneously by manufacturers across Western Europe around the same period. Ikarus wasn't playing catch-up here. In this particular category, it was, by most honest engineering assessments, playing at the front of the pack. The 280 model in particular became so common across Eastern Bloc cities that, for an entire generation of people living anywhere from East Berlin to Havana to remote industrial cities across Soviet Central Asia, the sight of one of these long, hinged, gently swaying vehicles rounding a corner wasn't a notable foreign import. It was simply what a city bus looked like. It was the default, the wallpaper of daily urban life. The export numbers, at the height of production, were genuinely staggering for a country the size of Hungary, which even today has a population smaller than many single American states. Ikarus vehicles were shipped to more than 100 countries around the world across the decades of its peak operation. And by far, overwhelmingly, the largest single customer, the buyer that anchored the entire company's production planning, its investment decisions, its factory expansion, literally everything, was the Soviet Union. Picture the actual scale of this relationship for a moment, because it's easy to hear a phrase like largest customer and not fully register what that meant in practice. The Soviet Union was, geographically, the largest country on Earth, spanning 11 time zones, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, with major cities separated by thousands upon thousands of kilometers of railway and highway. A country of that almost incomprehensible scale needed public transportation infrastructure on a level that few nations in history have ever required. And rather than attempting to build the entirety of that capacity domestically, competing for factory space and raw materials against its own arms and heavy industry programs, the Soviet leadership relied heavily on its allied economies, and above all on Hungary, to supply an enormous share of it. Some historical estimates from the period suggest that, at Ikarus's absolute peak years, considerably more than half of everything the company produced was destined specifically for Soviet cities and republics, with tens of thousands of vehicles delivered annually across the decades of this arrangement. A flow of buses so continuous and so vast that entire sections of the Székesfehérvár plant existed, in effect, purely to service one single foreign government's transit ministries. For a bus driver in Moscow, or Kyiv, or Tashkent, or some smaller industrial city in the Ural Mountains, whose name most Westerners would never learn, climbing into an Ikarus articulated bus every single morning wasn't some notable foreign encounter. It was simply the vehicle that took commuters to the factory, to the university, to the market. For tens of millions of people across the Soviet Union, across an entire generation, their daily commute, their most basic, repeated, unremarkable daily ritual, quite literally ran on Hungarian engineering, built by workers in a country most of those Soviet passengers had never visited and likely never would. Picture for a moment an ordinary weekday morning in a mid-sized Soviet industrial city sometime in the early 1980s. A long, hinged Ikarus 280 pulls up to a stop already crowded with people bundled against the cold, breath visible in the frozen air. The driver, who has probably been driving the exact same route for years, knows precisely how the articulated joint in the middle groans and shifts as passengers pack in near the accordion section, knows exactly which of the doors sticks slightly in freezing temperatures, knows the rhythm of the whole vehicle the way a sailor knows a familiar ship. None of the people boarding that bus are thinking about Hungary, about Székesfehérvár, about Comecon planning committees meeting in offices hundreds of kilometers away. They're thinking about being late for their shift, about the cold, about whether there'll be room to sit. The bus is invisible in the way that only genuinely successful infrastructure ever becomes invisible. It simply works, every single day, without anyone needing to think about where it came from or who built it. That invisibility, that complete unremarkable reliability across an entire continent's worth of daily commutes, is arguably the single greatest achievement in this entire story. And it's also exactly what makes the coming collapse so difficult for ordinary people, on both sides of that vanished border, to fully process when it finally happens. And Ikarus buses didn't stop at the borders of the Soviet bloc either. Cuba became a major customer beginning in the 1960s, its streets filled with Ikarus vehicles that, in some documented cases, remained in active service for extraordinarily long periods. Decades, in fact. A detail that speaks both to the genuine durability of the underlying engineering and, more grimly, to the extreme scarcity of any alternative under a long-standing American trade embargo that cut Cuba off from Western vehicle manufacturers entirely. If your bus is Hungarian and there's no realistic way to replace it, you learn to keep it running forever, and Cuban mechanics became legendarily skilled at doing exactly that. Ikarus vehicles reached as far as Mongolia, where they served sprawling, sparsely populated routes across the steppe. They reached various countries across Africa and the Middle East that maintained trade relationships with the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War, often as part of broader Soviet-aligned aid and trade packages. And in smaller, far more limited numbers, a genuinely surprising fact for a brand most Western audiences have never once heard of. Ikarus vehicles even found their way into test programs and niche transit applications in parts of North America, evaluated by transit authorities curious whether Eastern Bloc engineering could compete on cost even inside a Cold War rival's own market. It's worth pausing here to actually picture what one of these production lines looked like in practice, because the sheer physical scale of this operation is easy to state as a number and hard to actually visualize. Imagine a factory floor stretching the length of several football fields, chassis after chassis moving down the line in a continuous, almost hypnotic rhythm, with workers specializing in single, repeated tasks the way workers did on any large-scale assembly line anywhere in the world. Welding, fitting glass, mounting the accordion-style joint that connected the two halves of an articulated 280 model, testing hydraulic steering systems built to handle the extra stress of bending a vehicle in the middle while it was still moving at speed. This wasn't a boutique operation turning out a few hundred careful, handcrafted vehicles a year. This was heavy industrial mass production, operating at a scale that very few bus manufacturers anywhere in the world, east or west, could genuinely match. And the engineering behind it kept evolving, even inside a system that, in other industries we've covered on this channel, tended to freeze designs in place for decades at a time. Ikarus produced multiple generations of models through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Smaller intercity coaches for longer distance travel between cities, standard rigid city buses for ordinary urban routes, and the famous articulated models for high-capacity corridors in the largest cities. This model diversity mattered enormously, because it meant Ikarus wasn't a company that had gotten lucky with one good design and then simply repeated it forever, the way the Trabant essentially had. It was a company that kept refining and expanding its lineup to match an enormous range of different transportation needs across dozens of different countries with wildly different climates, road conditions, and urban layouts. Buses built to handle the brutal winters of Siberia had to be engineered very differently from buses built for the tropical heat and humidity of Havana, and Ikarus, remarkably, managed to serve both markets simultaneously. By the 1970s and into the 1980s, Ikarus had become, by many honest measures, the single largest bus manufacturer on the entire planet, a claim almost no one outside Hungary and its trading partners would have recognized at the time, precisely because so much of its enormous output disappeared quietly into the vast, largely closed transportation networks of the Soviet Union and its allies, rather than appearing at glamorous Western trade shows or on the streets of cities Western journalists actually covered. This was, in a real sense, one of the most successful industrial giants of the entire 20th century, operating almost entirely outside the West's awareness. This was Hungary's industrial pride made completely physical. A small country with a fraction of the population and land area of its Western European neighbors had somehow built one of the most dominant manufacturers in an entire heavy industry category. Dominant not in some narrow regional sense, but by genuine global output. Hungarian state media treated Ikarus with the same reverence East German media reserved for the Trabant, presenting it as living proof that centrally planned socialist industry could produce not merely adequate goods for domestic consumption, but genuinely world-leading exports that rivaled, and in sheer volume, exceeded anything the capitalist West could put on the road. But buried inside that extraordinary success was a number that, in hindsight, should have terrified anyone paying close attention to the company's long-term structural health. By some measures, at points during its peak years, roughly half, and at certain periods considerably more than half, of everything Ikarus produced was flowing to a single buyer. Not a diversified international market of dozens of roughly comparable customers, not even a single country's general commercial market, with multiple competing transit authorities and private operators. A single, centrally planned purchasing relationship with one government's ministry. Any business analyst operating inside a normal market economy would recognize this instantly as an extraordinary, almost reckless concentration risk, precisely the kind of dependency that companies in competitive industries actively work for years to avoid, deliberately diversifying their customer base specifically so that no single client's troubles, however severe, can sink the entire enterprise on its own. But Ikarus didn't operate in a normal competitive industry, and this wasn't a risk anyone inside the company had the power to correct, even if they'd wanted to. It operated inside a planned economic block where this kind of dependency wasn't a mistake waiting to be fixed. It was, by design, the entire point of the Comcon specialization system in the first place. Hungary built buses. The Soviet Union bought them, in enormous, centrally guaranteed quantities. That was the arrangement, negotiated at a level far above any factory manager's authority, and for more than 3 decades it worked precisely as intended, generating stability, steady growth, and genuine national pride. Right up until the moment the buyer disappeared. Through the 1980s, the first genuine warning signs began to surface, though at the time they were remarkably easy to misread, dismiss, or simply explain away as temporary friction, rather than the tremors of something much larger. The Soviet economy itself was beginning to show real structural strain, the kind that goes far beyond an ordinary bad year. The reforms associated with perestroika and glasnost were, among many other things, a public acknowledgement from the Soviet leadership itself that the existing economic system was struggling to sustain its own commitments across the board. Payments for Hungarian exports, including buses, occasionally slowed in ways that hadn't been common in earlier decades. Some orders were delayed, renegotiated downward, or shifted onto uncertain future timelines rather than fulfilled on schedule. To anyone at Ikarus paying genuinely close attention during these years, these were not isolated, unrelated administrative hiccups. They were early tremors radiating outward from a foundation that had already begun, quietly, to crack. At the very same time, something quite unusual was happening inside Hungary itself, something that makes this particular story genuinely different from the East German experience we covered previously. Compared to nearly all of its neighbors across the Eastern Bloc, Hungary had, for years already, been experimenting with a noticeably looser, more market-oriented version of socialism, an approach informally nicknamed goulash communism by observers both inside and outside the country. This system allowed for small-scale private enterprises to legally operate, introduced limited market pricing mechanisms in certain sectors, tolerated a modest private agricultural economy alongside collective farms, and produced a visibly higher standard of living than could be found in stricter neighboring states like Czechoslovakia or East Germany. Hungary, in many very real and tangible ways, was already changing faster than almost anywhere else in the entire Eastern Bloc, moving toward economic liberalization years, even more than a decade before the dramatic street-level events of 1989 swept across the wider region and captured the world's attention. This creates a genuinely fascinating and often completely overlooked tension sitting right at the heart of this particular story. Hungary's own domestic economy was already evolving. It was already opening up. It was already, in a meaningful sense, preparing itself for a more market-driven, internationally integrated future, years ahead of its neighbors. But the export market Ikarus depended on for its very survival, the market that had made the company into a global giant in the first place, hadn't caught up to any of this at all. It was still the exact same closed, centrally planned Soviet purchasing system it had always been, operating on the exact same rigid multi-year planning cycles it had used since the 1950s. Hungary, industrially and politically, was racing toward one kind of future, while remaining tethered, through Ikarus specifically, to an economic partner that was still living entirely in the old one, showing every sign of eventually breaking under its own accumulated weight. There's a particular kind of institutional blindness worth naming here, because it shows up again and again across this entire genre of industrial collapse story. When an organization's core success is built on a relationship that has worked flawlessly for 30 consecutive years, it becomes almost psychologically impossible for the people running that organization to seriously plan for the possibility that the relationship might end entirely, rather than simply have a rough year or two. Ikarus's planners in the mid to late 1980s were, by all accounts, aware that Soviet payments were slowing and that political changes were underway in Moscow. But awareness of strain is very different from genuine contingency planning for total collapse. Nobody sits down and drafts a serious backup plan for what happens if our largest customer, an entire nuclear superpower, simply stops existing within a few years. Because until 1991 actually happened, that scenario would have sounded less like sound business planning and more like paranoid science fiction to almost anyone in the industry, anywhere in the world. And that old partner, that vast, captive market Ikarus had spent 3 decades building its entire industrial identity around, was about to collapse entirely. Not gradually, over a comfortable decade of carefully managed economic transition that a company could plan around and adjust to, but essentially overnight, in the space of a single catastrophic year. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. This is a detail that deserves genuine emphasis here, because from a distance of decades, sitting comfortably in hindsight, it's very easy to treat this as simply an abstract political headline from a history textbook, rather than the direct, physical, industrial earthquake it actually represented for companies like Ikarus, sitting hundreds of kilometers away in Hungary. This wasn't simply a routine change of government, the kind that happens in any country every few years without disrupting existing trade relationships. The purchasing entity itself, the ministries, the state trading organizations, the entire vast centralized apparatus that had spent decades signing contracts, arranging payment schedules, and coordinating the delivery of tens of thousands of buses every single year across an enormous territory, ceased to exist as a functioning structure almost overnight, collapsing faster than most economists or industrial planners anywhere in the world had genuinely anticipated. Contracts that had been carefully signed, sometimes years in advance as part of Ikarus's normal long-range production planning, with a government that no longer existed in any recognizable functioning form, became effectively worthless pieces of paper almost instantly. The newly independent successor states emerging from the wreckage of the USSR, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and more than a dozen others, each suddenly responsible for governing itself for the first time in generations, were each, individually, facing their own catastrophic economic collapse, severe currency crises, and complete institutional chaos as they scrambled to build functioning independent governments almost from scratch. None of these newly formed states were in any realistic position to simply step in and honor the old Soviet Union's purchasing commitments as though nothing had changed. Many of them, in the desperate, chaotic early years of independence, could barely keep their own domestic economies functioning at all, let alone continue importing tens of thousands of buses a year from a Hungarian factory their new governments had inherited paperwork for, but no working relationship with. The scale of the resulting collapse in demand was almost immediate and almost total. Production numbers that had, throughout the entirety of the 1980s, remained consistently in the tens of thousands of vehicles annually, cratered within the space of just a year or two, by some measures falling to a small fraction of their previous levels. A collapse in demand so steep it would be almost unimaginable in any normal competitive industry, where customer bases are naturally spread across dozens or hundreds of independent buyers, rather than concentrated in a single, now-defunct government. This wasn't a slow, manageable decline that a company's management team could carefully plan around, gradually restructure its workforce to absorb, or negotiate its way through with patient creditors. It was the industrial equivalent of a single massive customer, representing more than half of an entire company's business, simply vanishing in the space of a few catastrophic months, with no warning period, no transition plan, and no possibility of an orderly wind-down. Try to imagine for a moment running any business, a factory, a farm, a small shop, and having the single client that generates the majority of your revenue simply inform you, with essentially no notice, that they will never be placing another order again, not because they've chosen a competitor, not because they're unhappy with your product, but because the government they represent has legally ceased to exist. There's no negotiation to be had. There's no discount you could offer, no improved delivery schedule, no upgraded feature that could win that business back, because the entity itself is gone. Every standard tool a struggling company normally reaches for, renegotiate terms, offer incentives, improve the product, court the client's rivals, is completely useless against a customer that has stopped existing as a legal and political fact. This is what made the Soviet collapse such a uniquely difficult kind of crisis for Ikarus to respond to, compared to an ordinary recession or even an ordinary bankruptcy of a major client. There was no relationship left to repair because there was no longer anyone on the other end of it. Hungary itself, meanwhile, was undergoing its own painful, sweeping economic transition throughout this exact same period, which made the situation for Ikarus even more precarious than it might otherwise have been. The country moved rapidly toward broad privatization throughout the early 1990s, systematically dismantling the old state-controlled industrial economy piece by piece and attempting to integrate itself into a genuinely competitive, market-based European economic system. For Ikarus specifically, this meant the company no longer had a protected, government-guaranteed export channel to fall back on, even in some diminished, reduced form. It now had to survive as a fully independent commercial enterprise, competing directly against well-established Western European bus manufacturers, companies that had spent decades operating inside genuinely competitive markets, continuously refining their products, their financing arrangements, their dealer networks, and their after-sales service in ways that Ikarus, having operated for its entire existence inside a guaranteed captive market, had simply never once needed to develop. What followed was a long, painful, repeatedly disappointing sequence of ownership changes that, in retrospect, reads almost like a textbook case study in exactly how difficult it is to rescue a company that was originally built around a single catastrophic point of failure. Various domestic Hungarian holding companies took control during the early years of privatization in the 1990s, each attempting to restructure the company's operations around a dramatically shrunken order book, laying off workers in successive waves, closing underused production lines, and searching desperately for new export markets to replace the vanished Soviet demand. Later in the 1990s and into the 2000s, the company passed through a series of different investors and strategic partners, some Hungarian, some foreign, each arriving with genuine enthusiasm and a fresh restructuring plan, and each, in turn, gradually discovering that the fundamental underlying math simply didn't work. A factory complex originally built and expanded to produce tens of thousands of buses a year for one enormous, guaranteed captive market has no easy, obvious path to profitability when it's suddenly trying to build a small fraction of that number for a competitive Western market that already had well-established suppliers, and that it was never designed or equipped to serve in the first place. Behind these repeated corporate maneuvers, behind every headline about a new investor or a new restructuring plan, were real people and a real physical place experiencing genuine, ongoing hardship. Székesfehérvár, the city that had grown for decades around the main Ikarus plant complex, had become, in the classic Eastern Bloc industrial pattern, something very close to a true company town. Generations of families whose entire livelihood, whose entire social identity and sense of community was tied directly and inseparably to the factory's fortunes. As production shrank dramatically through the 1990s, the workforce shrank right alongside it, in wave after wave of layoffs, each round a little larger and a little more permanent feeling than the one before it. Workers who had spent their entire adult careers, sometimes following in their own parents' footsteps, building buses destined for cities they would very likely never personally visit, Moscow, Havana, industrial towns scattered across a Soviet Union that no longer existed on any current map, found themselves, often in their 50s and 60s, having to navigate a completely unfamiliar, rapidly changing labor market inside a completely restructured national economy, with skills that had been perfectly suited to one very specific kind of industrial system, and suddenly far less transferable to anything else. There were genuine, sincere attempts at multiple different points throughout this long decline to pivot the company decisively toward Western European markets, where real, ongoing demand for buses obviously still existed in abundance. But these efforts consistently ran into a wall of extremely difficult practical obstacles that proved remarkably hard to overcome with the limited resources available. Western European transit authorities operated under entirely different safety standards, different emissions regulations, and different, far more rigorous procurement and certification processes than the centralized Soviet purchasing system Ikarus had spent decades mastering and optimizing for. Retooling entire factory lines, fundamentally redesigning vehicles from the ground up to meet these unfamiliar Western standards, and building the kind of extensive dealer and service network that Western transit operators had come to expect as standard practice, all required exactly the kind of significant, sustained capital investment that a company already reeling from the sudden loss of more than half its entire business simply did not have available. And as one restructuring plan after another failed to produce the promised turnaround, investors grew increasingly hesitant to keep pouring fresh money into a repeatedly reorganized enterprise with a visibly shrinking order book and an increasingly uncertain long-term future. Each new ownership era, watched closely by the remaining workers and by the wider Hungarian public, followed a strikingly similar and increasingly discouraging pattern. A new investor would arrive with genuine confidence, announce an ambitious turnaround plan complete with promising projections, secure a modest number of new orders to demonstrate early momentum. And then, as the underlying structural economics stubbornly failed to improve in any lasting way, would gradually sell off assets, scale back operations further, or quietly abandon the effort altogether, leaving just a little less of the original company intact than had existed before that particular chapter began. It's a pattern strikingly, almost instructively, different from the Trabant story that we covered in our previous video. There, the ending came in one sharp, decisive, almost violent collapse over the span of about 18 months. Here, at Ikarus, the ending stretched out instead over more than a full decade, a long, grinding, exhausting decline through repeated attempts at rescue, each one a little less convincing and a little less well-funded than the one that came before it. To really understand how disorienting this period was for the people living through it, it helps to imagine the whiplash of working the same job, on the same factory floor, through 3 or 4 completely different corporate identities in the space of a single decade. A worker who started the 1990s as an employee of a state-owned industrial giant might, by the end of that same decade, have technically worked for a domestic Hungarian holding company, then a joint venture with foreign capital, then a restructured entity under yet another name, each transition accompanied by new management teams promising a fresh start, new logos, new 5-year plans, and, almost every single time, another round of layoffs once the promised turnaround failed to materialize on schedule. Imagine explaining your own job title to a relative at a family dinner and realizing you're not entirely sure which company you technically work for this particular year, because the paperwork changed again 3 months ago, and nobody on the factory floor was given a clear explanation why. Some of these restructuring attempts did show brief, genuine flickers of promise. Small specialty orders occasionally came in from unexpected international buyers, momentarily reviving hope that a leaner, smaller Ikarus might find a sustainable niche, exporting more modest volumes to markets that valued the brand's reputation for tough, simple, easily maintained mechanical engineering. Precisely the kind of no-frills durability that had made Ikarus buses so beloved in Cuba, where they'd been kept running for decades past their expected lifespan out of sheer necessity. But a handful of promising niche orders, however genuine, could never come close to replacing the scale of what had been lost. The factory complex, the workforce, the entire supply chain of part suppliers scattered across Hungary had all been built and calibrated for an operation many, many times larger than what the post-Soviet order book could actually sustain. Every partial recovery was, in the end, still shrinking relative to what had come before. By the middle of the 2000s, what had once been, by many honest measures, the largest bus manufacturer on the entire planet had been reduced to a small, almost unrecognizable fraction of its former scale. Production numbers that, at their historic peak decades earlier, had reached tens of thousands of vehicles every single year, had fallen to a level that wouldn't have registered as anything more than a rounding error inside the company's Soviet-era heyday. The once sprawling Székesfehérvár industrial complex, which had employed thousands upon thousands of workers across its long history, now operated with a workforce a small fraction of that former size, in some years barely operating at any meaningful production scale at all. The Ikarus name itself didn't entirely disappear from existence, and this particular detail is genuinely worth noting because it sets this story apart from a clean, tidy, final ending. Various smaller ventures over the years and decades since have attempted to revive some limited form of the brand, occasionally producing small numbers of specialty or niche vehicles under the historic Ikarus name, a faint, diminished echo of the industrial giant that once single-handedly supplied entire nations with their daily public transportation. But nothing resembling the original global scale, the original 100-plus export markets, the original tens of thousands of vehicles a year ever returned, or realistically ever could return under the conditions of a competitive modern market. Unlike the Trabant, which we covered previously, and which found a genuine, celebrated second life as a beloved global cultural icon complete with dedicated museums, active fan clubs, and tourist experiences built entirely around nostalgia for the car itself, Ikarus's afterlife has been considerably quieter and far less triumphant. In the countries that once relied so heavily on its buses for their most basic daily transportation, there is real, genuine nostalgia. Transit enthusiasts and dedicated collectors across the former Eastern Bloc, who lovingly restore old Ikarus articulated buses, photograph them proudly at vintage transport rallies and heritage events, and remember them fondly and specifically as simply the correct, familiar shape a city bus was always supposed to have when they themselves were growing up. But there's no real equivalent anywhere of Berlin's Trabi Safari tourist experience. No globally recognized cultural icon status recognized outside the region. No single dramatic, unforgettable photograph of an Ikarus bus crossing a falling wall that circulated on front pages around the entire world. Its story ended not with one single unforgettable, iconic image, but with a slow, quiet, gradual fade that most of the world outside the former Eastern Bloc never even noticed happening at all. If you know where to look, though, that quiet affection is still genuinely visible today. Drive out to a vintage transport rally in Hungary, Poland, or one of the Baltic states on any given summer weekend, and you'll likely find a small cluster of lovingly restored Ikarus buses parked alongside other retired Eastern Bloc vehicles. Their owners, often retired drivers or mechanics, who once worked on these exact models professionally, polishing chrome trim and swapping stories about which model handled winter roads best, or which engine variant was most forgiving to repair with whatever parts happened to be available at the time. Online communities of enthusiasts across the former Eastern Bloc trade old technical manuals, hunt down increasingly rare original parts, and document surviving vehicles with the same careful devotion that classic car collectors anywhere in the world bring to their own passions. It's a smaller, quieter, more private kind of remembrance than the Trabant enjoys. No international tourist industry built around it, no dedicated standalone museum drawing visitors from around the globe, but it's real. And it speaks to how deeply these buses were woven into the ordinary texture of daily life across an entire region for the better part of half a century. So here's where this particular story ultimately lands, and here's exactly what makes it genuinely different from everything we've covered so far on this channel. Ikarus wasn't destroyed by its own internal greed, by some corrupt executive skimming profits, or by a hostile outside takeover engineered by investors deliberately looking to strip its remaining assets for a quick profit. There is no single clear villain here to point a finger at, no single boardroom decision you can isolate and say, this, right here, is the exact moment everything went wrong. Ikarus was destroyed, ultimately, by geography and by geopolitics, by the simple, brutal, unavoidable fact that the single most important customer in its entire business model happened to be an entire political entity rather than an ordinary commercial buyer. And that entity, through forces entirely beyond the company's control or even its awareness, collapsed. It's an industrial death sentence handed down not because of anything the company itself did wrong, but because of something that happened in a different country entirely, decided by completely different people, for political reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with buses, bus engineering, or industrial strategy at all. Where the Trabant, in our previous video, was killed by the very freedom its own people had spent decades fighting for and dreaming about. A strange, almost poetic, almost self-inflicted kind of ending. Ikarus was killed instead by a freedom that happened somewhere else entirely, hundreds and hundreds of kilometers away, in a collapse it had absolutely no control over, no advance warning of, and genuinely never saw coming until it was already, irreversibly, too late to meaningfully prepare for. Two industrial giants, built behind the exact same Iron Curtain, following remarkably similar decades of state-planned success. And yet two completely different reasons, two entirely different mechanisms for arriving at fundamentally the exact same kind of devastating ending. There's a broader lesson buried in this comparison that goes well beyond Cold War history, one that still applies to any business operating anywhere in the world today. Concentration, depending too heavily on a single customer, a single supplier, a single market, can look, for years or even decades, exactly like strength. Ikarus's dependence on the Soviet Union wasn't a hidden weakness that clever executives failed to notice. It was, for most of the company's existence, the very definition of its success, the thing that made it one of the largest manufacturers of its kind anywhere on Earth. That's precisely what makes this kind of vulnerability so dangerous. It doesn't look like a risk while things are going well. It looks like exactly the opposite. It looks like a company that has found the perfect customer, the perfect arrangement, the perfect formula for stability. The danger only becomes visible in hindsight, once the single point of failure actually fails, and by then, there's rarely enough time left to build the diversification that should have started decades earlier. It's tempting, looking back from today, to imagine that Ikarus's leadership should have seen this coming, should have diversified its customer base earlier, should have pushed harder into Western markets while there was still time and capital to do it properly. And there's something to that critique. But it's also worth remembering that this wasn't simply a company making an unforced strategic error. It was a company operating inside an entire political and economic system that had been deliberately designed, at a level far above any single factory's management, to create exactly this kind of dependency. Diversifying away from the Soviet market wasn't just a matter of ambition or foresight. It would have meant working against the entire logic of the Comecon system that Ikarus's home country belonged to, a system Hungary itself had very little independent power to simply opt out of. In that light, the collapse looks less like a failure of imagination by any one company's leadership, and more like the almost inevitable outcome of an entire regional economic order that had never been built with its own eventual disappearance in mind. And the next story in this series takes us to a completely different kind of collapse altogether. A company that built vehicles so legendarily tough, so famously capable of surviving almost anything the harshest roads on Earth could possibly throw at them, that they became a genuine, celebrated legend among off-road engineers and enthusiasts around the entire world. This time, the villain isn't some distant political collapse happening in another country entirely. It's something considerably closer to home. A slow-motion internal corporate battle, deep-rooted internal conflict, and a chaotic privatization process that ultimately tore one of the most respected and admired names in heavy vehicle manufacturing apart, piece by piece, from the inside. If you want to see exactly how an industrial legend can be destroyed, not by outside forces beyond anyone's control, but by the very people who were supposed to protect it and carry it forward, subscribe, because that story is coming next.